This is an excerpt from a letter Frost wrote on May 2nd, 1913, from the cottage affectionately known as the Bunghole in Beaconsfield. Dear Sidney Cox, we are pretty much at home here by now. You ought to see us, theoretically up to our eyes in the flowers of an English spring. And I could say actually, if we were, as our neighbors, amateurs of gardening. I like that about the English. They all have time to dig in the ground for the unutilitarian flower. I mean the men. It marks the great difference between them and our men. I like flowers, you know, but I like them wild, and I'm rather the exception than the rule in an American village. Far as I've walked in pursuit of the cypripedium, I've never met another in the woods on the same quest. Americans will dig for peas and beans and such like utilities, but not, if they know it, for posies. I know a man who was a byword in 5 townships for the flowers he tended with his own hand. Neighbors kept hens and let them run loose just to annoy him. I feel my education in useless things has been neglected when I see the way the front yards blossom down this road. But never mind. I have certain useless accomplishments to my credit. No one will charge me with having an eye single to the main chance. So I can afford perhaps to yield to others for one spring in the cultivation of one form of the beautiful. Next year I go in for the daffodils. Sorry. This is an excerpt from the North of Boston narrative poem, The Self-Seeker, in which a man crippled in a sawmill accident and accepting meager compensation comments on his unpaid passion for native flowers. His friend says to him, "But your flowers, man, you're selling out your flowers." Yes, that's one way to put it. All the flowers of every kind everywhere in this region for the next 40 summers. Call it 40. But I'm not selling those, I'm giving them. They never earned me so much as 1 cent. Money can't pay me for the loss of them. No, the 500 was the sum they named to pay the doctor's bill and tied me over.
A review from the Daily News, July the 22nd, 1914. A new poet, Robert Frost, north of Boston. This is one of the most revolutionary books of modern times, but one of the quietest and least aggressive. It speaks, and it is poetry. It consists of 15 poems from 50 to 300 lines long, depicting scenes from life, chiefly in the country in New Hampshire. The poems are revolutionary because they lack the exaggeration of rhetoric, and even, at first sight, appear to lack the poetic intensity of which rhetoric is an imitation. Their language is free from the poetical words and forms that are the chief material of secondary poets. Mm-hmm. The meter avoids not only the old-fashioned pomp and sweetness, but the later fashion also of discord and fuss. Mm-hmm. In fact, the medium is common speech and common decasyllables. Yet almost all the poems are beautiful. They depend not at all on objects commonly admitted to be beautiful. Neither have they merely a homely beauty, but are often grand, sometimes magical. Mm-hmm. Many, if not most, of the separate lines and separate sentences are plain and in themselves nothing, but they are bound together and made elements of beauty by a calm eagerness of emotion. It is poetry because it is better than prose.
Eleanor, Edward has written another review of North of Boston for New Weekly. Listen to this. Mr. Frost has, in fact, gone back, as Whitman and as Wordsworth went back, through the paraphernalia of poetry, into poetry again. With a confidence like genius, he has trusted his conviction that a man will not easily write better than he speaks when some matter has touched him deeply. And he has turned it over until he has no doubt what it means to him. When he has no purpose to serve beyond expressing it, and when he has no audience to be bullied or flattered, when he is free and speech takes one form and no other. Whatever discipline further was necessary, he has got from the use of the good old English medium of blank verse.
This England, Dimmock, Gloucestershire, from the journal The Nation, November the 7th, 1914. It was a part of the country I'd never known before, and I had no connection with it. But now, 3 meadows away lived a friend, and once or twice or 3 times a day, I used to cross the meadows, the gate, and the 2 stiles. The first was a concave meadow in April strewn with daffodils. Where the path ceased, the little house of whitened bricks and black timbers lay a few yards up the road. A vegetable garden in front, with a weeping ash and a bay tree, a walnut in a yard of cobbles and grass behind, a yew tree on the roadside, an orchard on the other. How easy it was to spend a morning or afternoon in walking over to this house, stopping to talk to whoever was about for a few minutes, and then strolling with my friend, nearly regardless of footpaths, in a long loop, so as to end either at his house or my lodging. Some of the meadows had a group or line of elms, one an ash rising out of an islet of dense brambles. Many had several great old apple or pear trees. The apples, chiefly cider apples, innumerable, rosy and uneatable, though once or twice we did pick up a wasp's remnant, with slightly greasy skin of palest yellow that tasted delicious. If talk dwindled in the traversing of a big field, the pause at gate or stile braced it again. Often we prolonged the pause, whether we actually sat or not, and we talked of flowers, childhood, Shakespeare, women, England, the war. Or we looked at a far horizon which some dip or gap occasionally disclosed. Then one evening, the new moon made a difference. The sky was banded with rough masses in the northwest, but the moon, a stout orange crescent, hung free of cloud near the horizon. At one stroke, I thought, like many other people, what things that same new moon sees eastward about the Meuse in France. Of those who could see it there, not blinded by smoke, pain, or excitement, how many saw it and heeded? I was deluged in a second stroke by another thought, or something that overpowered thought. All I can tell is it seemed to me that either I had never loved England, or I'd loved it foolishly, aesthetically, like a slave, not having realized that it was not mine, unless I was willing and prepared to die rather than leave it, as Belgian women and old men and children had left their country. Something I had omitted, something I felt had to be done before I could look again composedly at English landscape, at the elms and poplars about the houses, at the purple-headed wood betony with 2 pairs of dark leaves on a stiff stem, who stood sentinel among the grasses or bracken, by hedge side or wood's edge. What he stood sentinel for, I did not know, any more than what I had got to do.
2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps a better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I should be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference.
Frost and Eleanor Fargen have kindled the latent poet in Edward. 15th of December, 1914. Dear Frost, I'm in it and no mistake. I have an idea I am full enough, but that my bad habits and customs and duties of writing will make it rather easy to write when I have no business to. At the same time, I find myself engrossed and conscious of a possible perfection as I never was in prose. Also, I'm very impatient of my prose and of reviews and review books, and yet I've been uncommonly cheerful. Mostly. I've been rather pleased with some of the pieces, of course, but it's not wholly that. Still, I won't begin thanking you just yet, though, if you like, I will put it down now, that you are the only begetter right enough. My works are pouring in on you now. Tell me all you dare about them. I've been shy of blank verse, though or because I like it best. But the rhymes have dictated themselves decidedly, except in one case. The signpost. The dim sea glints chill. The white sun is shy, and the skeleton weeds and the never dry rough long grasses keep white with frost at the hilltop by the finger post. The smoke of traveller's joy is puffed over hawthorn berry and hazel tuft. I read the sign. Which way shall I go? A voice says, you would not have doubted so at 20. Another voice, gentle with scorn, says, at 20 you wished you'd never been born. One hazel lost a leaf of gold from a tuft at the tip, when the first voice told the other he wished to know what 'twould be to be 60 by this same post. You shall see, he laughed, and I had to join his laughter. You shall see, but either before or after, whatever happens, it must befall. A mouthful of earth to remedy all regrets and wishes shall freely be given. And if there be a flaw in that heaven, 'twill be freedom to wish. And your wish may be to be here or anywhere, talking to me, no matter what the weather on earth, at any age between death and birth, to see what day or night can be, the sun and the frost, the land and the sea, summer, autumn, winter, spring, with a poor man of any sort, down to a king, standing upright out in the air, wondering where he shall journey. Oh, where?
Thus endeth the epistle. Epistles.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you,
Part one.
Tom. And I love that beautiful contrast in voices between you. That was really excellent. The early years then.
Yes.
What struck me immediately, listening to those beautiful readings, was how seamlessly Thomas seemed to move from prose to poetry. How much of his poetry was already embedded in the prose. There's nothing equivalent in Frost. Frost finds his way as a poet by working through antiquated poetic forms. You can sort of see his apprenticeship working itself out. But Thomas's prose is so lush and poetic that it really is just a kind of shaping into form that occurs more than a discovery of a new voice or a different voice. It was quite remarkable.
Yes, at the same time, Thomas, through all his reading of poetry, and he was constantly reading poetry since he fell in love with it as a teenager, and in his reviewing of poetry, he had been absorbing the forms of English poetry. And one thing about his reviewing, which was for 2 daily newspapers, we can't believe that these days, was that he was reviewing editions of older poets as well as contemporary poetry. He was doing reviewing these side by side, so that his reading of contemporary poetry was always informed by his poetry. So that there's that, as well as the material in the prose, which is transformed and transmuted, that he seemed to have absorbed almost everything he needed to know about poetry before he actually wrote it.
One of the things that I like about Thomas's prose is the hard material world that he writes about. And I think Frost shared some affinities with that hard material world. Unlike the earlier wanderers in American literature, such as Emerson, for example, you know, the natural world was always subordinate to mental processes. They were secondary to the way that the mind interpreted or thought about the ideal world of our existence. And with Frost and Thomas, that hard material world of flora and fauna, of natural things, comes through so beautifully. And the cadence of Thomas's prose as he's walking or as he's, you know, wandering through the English countryside contributes to the beauty of the world that he's looking at. And Frost was also a famous walker, as was Thomas. I mean, they could both go miles in a day. Thomas, for example, could walk 50 miles in a day around steep, and they were always looking, always observing the natural world, but always thinking about how the mind could interpret and shape. So there's a nice stasis between mental and material processes in their poetry that I think they both recognized in each other.
If I could just say something there as well, I found it very interesting listening to those excerpts, thinking about the relationship, if you like, between masculinity and a love of flowers and a love of the countryside there. There's that opening section that we had with Frost noting as something kind of very English about the fact that you would grow flowers and that this seems like a male hobby in England. It just occurred to me as that has been read out, that's exactly a point that D.H. Lawrence made about growing up in a coal mining community. So I just looked it up as you were reading, actually. And Lawrence, looking back at his childhood, said that, talking about the colliers, he said they had a genuine love of the beauty of flowers. I have known it often and often in colliers. I've seen many a collier stand in the back garden looking down at a flower with that odd remote sort of contemplating, which shows a real awareness of the presence of beauty. It would not even be admiration or joy or delight or any of these things which so often have a root in the possessive instinct. It would be a sort of contemplating which shows the incipient artist. And then again in the essay, This England, which we heard wonderfully, what essentially Thomas is saying is that I've got to fight to defend flowers. You know, he's talking at the end, if I want to look at flowers again, and if I love English flowers, you know, I've got to be prepared to put my life on the line. So there's this wonderful, you know, you talk about the hard realities of things and the hard realities of the countryside, but there's also that relationship between being a man, you know, and some of that comes through in Thomas's writing in terms of fighting the gamekeeper and all of those kind of themes, but also a love of the countryside and how that somehow strangely fits in with the First World War.
Just a footnote, Yeats generally didn't want to have flowers in his poems because he thought it was an English thing. So his main flowers are symbolic roses rather than anything more mundane.
Yes, and I was going to say something since you brought up the gamekeeper. This England, you know, kind of puts the lie to the idea that that Frost might have held, that Thomas was kind of shamed into going to war to prove his manliness, because there was, I think he was driven more by love of country. I think that's just really apparent in these first things, and he wanted to have a long life here. And the signpost, you know, what a wonderful thing. He never got to look back from that older age.
You know, it's interesting, Guy, when you're talking about the masculinity. I mean, there's that phrase in Frost where the men pursue the unutilitarian flower. You know, you stop and think about early 20th century America with that bully pragmatism and the industrial ethos, and everything is so set in a kind of masculine pursuit of business and industry. And the fact that Frost goes to England, I think he goes to England because he sees in England that the land and the country is far more conducive to the land of Quiller Couch and Palgrave, where even the men could write poetry and not be, quote, a byword as they are in America in some way. And so if Thomas is in some ways trying to be more masculine at times, I think in some ways Frost is trying to be a bit more feminine and escape the bully masculine ethos of the early 20th century.
I wonder, does that have any bearing on the mysterious case of the road not taken, which I know there's some argument about the date, but I think was written in and about autumn 1914. And Frost designed the poem as an imitation of Thomas's indecisiveness, because after they'd gone for a walk, supposedly Thomas would lament that they hadn't gone in another direction. So he actually conceived that poem as a sort of parody of Thomas, and maybe also in a curious way wrote Thomas's first poem, or wrote the first poem in a kind of Thomas voice, except it was Frost's imitation of that voice. And maybe as a result, that's why there is so much argument actually over interpretation of the road not taken. I presume you know David Orr's wonderful book about that poem. It's the book Finding America in the poem Everyone Loves and Everyone Gets Wrong. Because there's a tendency in America to interpret that poem as a kind of version of My Way, you know, as sung by Frank Sinatra. And Thomas and Frost actually quarreled about it, about their readings of it. And I think that's partly because they were both in it, and neither of them understood that they were both in it, because it's a mixture of Frostian decisiveness, possibly, and Thomas's indecisiveness, and that's why it's so complex and ambiguous in the literal sense.
Well, Frost.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say there's a short passage from the play. This verse business after I say the poem. I say, you know, that poem isn't very like me. That's like a friend of mine. He said to me when we came to a place like that, going home, a fork in the road. I said, which way? He said, doesn't matter. Whichever way you go, you'll be sorry you didn't go the other.
I was just going to say, I once had the strange and fairly awful experience of going to a management retreat, university management retreat, where they began the day by saying, the theme for today is going to be a poem. You'll have not heard of this poem. It's by a poet called Robert Frost. I'm going to read The Road Not Taken. And they read it out and it was entirely misinterpreted. And I was obviously sitting there squirming in my seat, not wanting to put my hand up to rewrite their interpretation of the poem. But it was all about, you should be a leader and you should make decisions and not worry about getting them wrong, and you should show strength, and you'll take the right course and all of that, and don't worry about the road you've not taken, which is a kind of misinterpretation of the poem quite wonderfully. But there we are. It's even made its way into management speak.
And advertisements.
Yes.
Well, I have a promotional poster with it.
It's extraordinary how many people
Sorry?
identify the poem as the title of the poem as The Road Less Traveled. So many people have asked me if I'm going to read The Road Less Traveled, and I go, that's not the one he was thinking about. He was thinking about the one he didn't travel.
Before we leave those flowers behind, horticulture, of course, as a business, was always thriving in the United States, and it was an acceptable occupation for a man. It's the utilitarian flowers, and Frost actually kind of was given a license to love them by an older friend of his, a man named Carl Burrell, who was in many ways a kind of master botanist who encouraged Frost in the pursuit of the utilitarian, and Burrell's own gender identity was fluid. He was in some ways, he's the figure of the self seeker, and Frost kind of lives in Burrell's identity in that poem, and it is another justification, this one on American ground and much more strenuously challenged by the society around him, the pursuit of the flower for its own sake, for beauty's sake. So by the time Frost gets to England, he has in many ways already rehearsed that problem of what is it permissible for a man to do in the pursuit of the aesthetic as opposed to the practical. And Burrell gave him a kind of a conflicted example of what it could cost for a man to do that. So Frost had misgivings about that pursuit of beauty.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add about the road not taken. That there does seem to be a lot of Frost in it. I mean, he says it's about Thomas's dithering and Thomas's hesitation and uncertainty about what step to take. But he sent it to Frost. He sent it to Thomas in the kind of late spring of 15, when he himself is trying to sort of negotiate a sort of a re-entry into American culture and literary world, and also trying to think about his own withdrawal from the scene of conflict. That he'd taken a boat back from the UK to the US in sort of February 15, and I think this sense of, well, have I made the right decision? Have I taken the right road? Wasn't only about Thomas's kind of quite strenuous and thoughtful negotiation with his own sense of, I've got to die for my country if I'm going to love it, but also Frost's feelings of, well, am I a man if I've run away from the war?
Mm-hmm. And it took a ditherer of Thomas's quality to make Frost look decisive. I mean, if you look at Frost's early life, everyone around him considered him to be a ditherer. It took Frost a long time to come to any sense of purpose or direction. If you had asked his grandfather, he would quite readily have identified Frost as the protagonist of that poem.
Yeah, that's I completely agree. Yeah.
We've had a question around Road Not Taken, so going a little bit off track, no pun intended. So Road Not Taken was written a year before Signpost. Both poems metaphorically evoke forking paths. Could the repetition of the word frost in Edward's poem be a subtle acknowledgement, perhaps, of Robert's inspirational influence? And that's a question from Stuart Howard.
I just want to say, The Road Not Taken was written in autumn 1914, and then Frost did send it indeed, as Ralph says, to Thomas again at the time when Thomas was supposedly making his mind up about the war or going to America. And as Ralph said, Frost may have had made other decisions in his own life. So it had a continued life in their relationship from the original writing of the poem. I must say, I think that's a very nice idea, the word frost in the poem, and allusion. But one reason why I believe The Road Not Taken was written in that autumn is because the Signpost, whether consciously or unconsciously, does seem to be a response to it. At some level, it certainly is. And the difference is that the protagonist of the signpost actually doesn't budge from the actual signpost. It's sort of, he kind of, speaker remains at that crossroads, wondering. And I think that's very Edward Thomas.
Well, the speaker in the Frost poem never budges either. He only imagines a future looking back. So in some ways, when Thomas leaps ahead in the poem to look back from 60, he's actually doing what Frost's poem had earlier dramatized, and that is the stand in one place, leap ahead, and look back. So yeah, it seems to me that the Frost allusions could be very deliberate.
Yeah. And there's the strange thing about the reference to blank verse and to rhyme. And I thought one of you would set this up, because he says that I fall into rhyme and it's organic. The rhymes seem to be organic except for one. And I thought, oh, that's why they want the signpost here, because signpost rhymes with Frost. It's the one sort of odd rhyme in that whole poem. And there seems to be a lot in the air at the moment about Shakespearean heroes and T.E. Lawrence, and it all seems to be a 20th century thing. That Stan Smith says this, here is this poor little puppet, Edward Thomas, by the signpost, and these two voices are talking about it. He's at a crossroads in other poems as well, and it seems as if it's a human dilemma that you are at, whether it's the Scottish person or Hamlet, to be or not to be. The quintessential human thing is to be at a crossroads, and somehow they are impelled to do something which they're not really in control of. There's a lovely documentary about T. Lawrence last night or 2 nights ago, and it just showed that here he was dreaming that he could be King Arthur and going off and doing things to liberate the poor Arabs, and suddenly finding that, oh, people get their heads blown off and their corpses are strewn all over the railway tracks. And then the politicians are all sort of saying, oh no, we're not going to keep to our promises. And so it's this strange thing of him being impelled to do something against his will.
Thomas did say that he knew that Hamlet was written for him.
Yes, they did. I suppose that every man thinks that Hamlet was written for him, but I know he was written for me. We used to start our program with that.
There's a poem he wrote just when Frost got on board the ship, first known when lost. And I wonder if the kind of lost is, as you're suggesting, Tom, a kind of echo of the name.
That was fascinating. Lovely discussion. As I say, great reading and so on. So I suppose now we move towards the war years, which is kind of the next phase in the relationships.
I think it's Bob's turn to introduce this.
Yeah, so
Action.
Over to you.
Oh, okay. We're entering the next phase of the relationship where Edward Thomas is actually deciding to go enlist into World War I in the Artist Rifles. And if the, quote, physician will approve him for enlistment. And Robert Frost, of course, was kind of wheedling Edward Thomas into making some sort of a decision. And I know we'll be discussing that quite a bit. But Thomas does go to war. And as soon as he goes to war, the war releases in him a kind of fury of creativity. Within just a couple of years' time, Edward Thomas writes roughly 130 poems, if I'm not mistaken. And this remarkable explosion of creativity comes during and after his enlistment. And so I'm going to just kind of leave it there, where we see some of the debates between Robert Frost and Thomas implied in some of the readings. And And of course, Thomas is killed on April 9th by a pipsqueak bomb that hits him, I believe, while he's lighting his pipe, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll just leave it there and allow our readers to go ahead.
All right, we begin with June 26, 1915. Dear Edward, you begin to talk as if you weren't coming to America to farm. We've gone too far into the wilds for you or something. It was inconsiderate of us. Well, listen, this farm is intended for the lecture camp. We won't make it our winter home for more than a couple of years. It is a picturesque spot, and it is in the region where I have to take refuge for 2 months a year from hay fever. That's all you can say for it. About all it raises is grass and trees. Sometime we will have a real fruit farm again further down along, but this place will always be here for our lecture camp scheme when that shall come to anything. Meanwhile, it represents a small investment. The year's interest on it is less than the rent we've been accustomed to paying for our 2 months' stay in the mountains. I think the pine and spruce on the place will increase in value more than $50 a year. I think I told you the farm is to cost $1,000.
Sunday, the 11th of July, 1915, from Steep, near Petersfield. My dear Robert, I suppose you are amusing yourself with imagining reasons for my apparently not wanting to come and live in New Hampshire. I don't expect to find anything elsewhere I should like as well. But I know I could not make any kind of living on the land, and I cannot yet see that I should make more out of literature than I should from Steep. When the summer camp school becomes clearer, I shall feel differently. Last week, I'd screwed myself up to the point of believing I should come out to America and lecture if anyone wanted me to. But I have altered my mind. I'm going to enlist on Wednesday if the doctor will pass me. I am aiming at the Artists' Rifles, a territorial battalion chiefly for training officers, so I must let them make an officer of me if they can. This is easier to do than to come out to you and see what turns up. But it will train me for the greater step. I wish I could explain how it came about, but I don't quite know. Also, a long explanation would be very superfluous if I get refused. I shall write again at the end of the week. If I'm rejected, then I shall still perhaps come out in September. Thursday, the 15th of July, 1915. My dear Robert, it is done. The doctor passed me yesterday, and I'm going up again on Monday to be attested and get my uniform. 7 of us were examined together, stripped and measured and made to hop around the room on each foot. I suppose I was too excited, and he kept sounding my left side and asking me if I'd ever had rheumatic fever, etc. There was one man of my age, 37, the rest boys, mostly clerks. The corps is now only nominally reserved for the professional classes. Now I'm on my way home to clear things up a little and get a walk with Helen on the Downs. I hope this is not making you think I don't want to come out. When I do come, I shall be readier to do other new things, such as lecturing. Well, that is, if I do not crock up.
Franconia, New Hampshire, July 31st, 1915. Dear Edward, I am within a hair of being precisely as sorry and as glad as you are. You are doing it for the self-same reason I shall hope to do it for if my time ever comes and I am brave enough. Namely, because there seems nothing else for a man to do. You have let me follow your thought in every twist and turn toward this conclusion. I know pretty well how far down you have gone and how far off sideways, and I think the better of you for it all. Only the very bravest could have come to the sacrifice this way. I've never seen anything more exquisite than the pain you've made of it. You are a terror, and I admire you. For what has a man locomotion if it isn't to take him into things he is between barely and not quite standing? I should have liked you anyway. No friend ever has to strive for my approval, but you may be sure I'm not going to like you less for this. All belief is one, and this proves you are a believer. I can't think what you would ask my forgiveness for, unless it were for saying my poetry is better than it is. You're forgiven as I hope to be forgiven for the same fault. I've had to overstate myself in the fight to get up. Someday, I hope I can afford to lean back and deprecate as excessive the somewhat general praise I may have won for what I may have done. Your last poem, Aspens, seems the loveliest of all. You must have a volume of poetry ready for when you come marching home. I wonder if they're going to let you write to me as often as ever. Affectionately, R.F. Then November 6, 1916. Dear Edward, you know how I feel about the war. I have stopped asseverating from a sense of fitness. You rather shut me up by enlisting. Talk is almost too cheap when all your friends are facing bullets. I don't believe I ought to enlist, since I am, of course, an American, but if I can't enlist, at least I refuse to talk sympathy beyond a certain point. I did set myself to wish this country into war. I made a little noise on the subject, but soon found out I wasn't half as good at the noise as some who cared less. When all the world is facing danger, it's a shame not to be facing danger for any reason, old age, sickness, or any other. Words won't make the shame less. There's no use trying to make out that the shame we suffer makes up for the more heroic things we don't suffer. No more of this for a long time. Not the magazines chock full of it.
A dream. Over known fields with an old friend in dream I walked, but came sudden to a strange stream. Its dark waters were bursting out most bright from a great mountain's heart into the light. Then back into a pit they plunged, once more as black as at their birth. And I stood thinking there, how white had the day shone on them they were, heaving and coiling. So by the roar and hiss, and by the mighty motion of the abyss, I was bemused. But I forgot my friend, and neither saw nor sought him till the end, when I awoke from waters unto men, saying, I shall be here some day again.
An excerpt from The Bonfire, in which the poet wants to take his children up the hill to burn a huge pile of brush. Oh, let's go up the hill and scare ourselves, as reckless as the best of them tonight, by setting fire to all the brush we piled with pitchy hands to wait for rain or snow. Oh, let's not wait for rain to make it safe. The pile is ours. We dragged it bough on bough down dark converging paths between the pines. Let's not care what we do with it tonight. Divide it? No, but burn it as one pile the way we piled it. And let's be the talk of people brought to windows by a light thrown from somewhere against their wallpaper. Rouse them all, both the free and not so free, with saying what they'd like to do to us, for what they'd better wait till we have done. Let's all but bring to life this old volcano, if that is what the mountain ever was, and scare ourselves. Let wildfire loose, we will. And scare you too, the children said together. If it scares you, what will it do to us? Scare you. But if you shrink from being scared, what would you say to war if it should come? That's what the reasons I should like to know. If you can comfort me by any answer. Oh, but war's not for children. It's for men. Now we're digging almost down to China. My dears, you thought that. We all thought it. So your mistake was ours. Haven't you heard, though? about the ships where war has found them out at sea, about the towns where war has come through opening clouds at night with droning speed, further o'erhead than all but stars and angels, and children in the ships and in the towns? Haven't you heard what we have lived to learn? Nothing so new, something we had forgotten. War is for everyone, for children too. I wasn't going to tell you, and I mustn't. The best way is to come up the hill with me and have our fire and laugh and be afraid.
2nd of April 1917. My dear Robert, hearing that the mails have been lost several times lately at sea, I thought I'd better make another shot at you. This is another penultimate letter. Things are closely impending now and will have happened before you get this, and you will know all about them. So I'll not try to tell you what they are, especially as I could not get them past the censor. I have seen some new things since I wrote last, and had mud and worse things to endure, which do not become less terrible in anticipation, but are less terrible once I am in the midst of them. I see and hear more than I did because changed conditions compel us to go up to the very front among the infantry to do our observation, and we spend nights without shelter in the mud, chiefly waiting for the morning and the arrival of the relief. It's a 24-hour job and takes more than that to recover. But it is far from yet from being unendurable. The unendurable thing was having to climb up the inside of a chimney that was being shelled. I gave up. It was impossible and I knew it, yet I went up to the beastly place and had 4 shells burst very close and decided that I would go back. As a matter of fact, I had no light and no information about the method of getting up, so that all the screwing up I had given myself would in any case have been futile. It was just another experience, like the gamekeeper. But it lies far less in my mind, because the practical result of my failure was nil, and I now see far more from the ground level than I could have seen from 200 feet up the factory chimney. Otherwise, I've done all things so far asked of me without making any mess, and I've mingled satisfaction with dissatisfaction in about the usual proportion, comfort and discomfort. There are so many things to enjoy, and if I remember rightly, not more boredom than, say, a year or 10 years ago. I think I get surer of some primitive things that one has got to be sure of about myself and other people. And I think this is not due simply to being older. In short, I am glad I came out, and I think less about return than I thought I should. Partly, no doubt, I inhibit the idea of return. I only think by flashes of the things at home that I used to enjoy and should again. I enjoy many of them out here when the sun shines, and at early morning and late afternoon. I doubt if anybody here thinks less of home than I do, and yet I doubt if anybody loves it more. And I hear nothing of you. Yet you are no more like an American in a book than you were 2.5 years ago. You are among the unchanged things that I cannot or dare not think of except in flashes. I don't have memories except such as are involved in my impressions as I see or hear things about me. But if I went on writing like this, I should make you think I was as damnably introspective as ever, and practice the art too. Good night to you and Eleanor and all. Remember, I'm in 244 Siege Battery, BEF, France, and shall remain 2nd Lieutenant Edward Thomas. Yours ever. Lights out. I have come to the borders of sleep, the unfathomable deep forest where all must lose their way, however straight or winding, soon or late, they cannot choose. Many a road or track that since the dawn's first crack up to the forest brink deceive the travellers, suddenly now blurs, and in they sink. Here love ends, despair, ambition ends. All pleasure and all trouble, although most sweet or bitter, here ends in sleep that is sweeter than tasks most noble. There is not any book or face of dearest look that I would not turn from now. To go into the unknown, I must enter and leave alone, I know not how. The tall forest towers, its cloudy foliage lowers ahead, shelf above shelf. Its silence I hear and obey, that I may lose my way and myself.
Thank you for those lovely readings. Oh my goodness, so moving, just brilliant.
One almost unbearable when you know the outcome. Extraordinary. Both tremendous.
Beautiful reading.
Beautiful readings.
I guess one of the questions that we might want to talk about is, why does Thomas enlist? I mean, a lot of people have some differing ideas about why Thomas enlists, and I'm curious to know what some of you think. I know that Thomas's domestic life was a source of anxiety for him in many ways, and he was quite ill-suited to his domestic life. There have been some arguments that Helen's love for him was overbearing, and that maybe his desire to enlist was a way of escaping from some of the turmoil of his home life. Maybe it was, as we've suggested before, as Guy suggested, that he wanted to defend the English flowers and the land itself that he loved. We know that he wasn't very jingoistic like Rupert Brooke in some of his early poems. I'm thinking of Brooke's poem, A Soldier, for example. You know, there's that sense where I don't think that Thomas felt any animosity toward the Germans or other enemies. So I'm curious to know what the rest of you think.
I think in some ways Frost summed it up when he told a correspondent that Edward Thomas went to death because he didn't like going. And Guy has referred to the gamekeeper episode, which has come up in several of the extracts. And this was the incident in which he and Frost were out walking the Dimmock area and were challenged by a gamekeeper who I think was in the grip of wartime paranoia about strangers. And Frost later went round and confronted the gamekeeper, but Thomas didn't, and felt in that way, and felt he hadn't been brave. And so, you know, it's back to questions of manliness and bravery. I also know that when he was writing about Rupert Brooke to Frost, when he had to write an obituary for Rupert Brooke, he told Frost that he didn't feel almost he had the right to criticize some of the attitudes in Brooke's poetry because he hadn't enlisted or fought the gamekeeper. You know, so to me, that's quite central. There may be other factors too.
I think with a lot of people too, surely, I mean, just to follow on from that, there was a sense of guilt about the fact that other people were doing the fighting, and why do you have the right to sit at home and not fight? And that fits into the masculinity idea and wanting to fight for your country and so forth. But we get that even from the essay This England very early on in the war, that sense of being aware that other people are putting their lives on the line, and ultimately what is the moral justification for not joining in. I'd also add, though, I suspect personally that I think it's very hard to say about anybody's motivations exactly what the reasons are, and there's never normally one specific, easily kind of quoted kind of explanation. I mean, how can many of us explain any of the decisions we make in our lives? They all come from a whole range of different feelings and things that you're probably not even conscious of yourself. So with Thomas, even more so, given how complex a character he was, I doubt there was one simple explanation to why he acted the way he did.
As a struggling artist, how much is the economic necessity? There's a married man with 3 children. Literature is in a strange state because of the war, and he is exhausted doing all that review work. I mean, Sean Street pointed out the number of reviews he writes, and they're all they're quality reviews. And then the other sort of set books and everything, but it was exhausting him doing all that with the family around and all those things. Then there's the war. What job do you do? He wants a regular job. At one moment he says, I want to get a pension for Helen. If something happens, she gets a pension, she gets life security. And I think, I don't hear it mentioned very often that we now know he was a great success because he was a great poet, but at the time he was just floundering around and needed money and needed a regular income.
But I think, if anything, that emphasizes the need to separate some of these decisions. Thomas himself obviously felt a need to explain, not only to Frost. I mean, this is no case of petty right and wrong as an effort to explain to the world why he did what he did. But it's one thing to join. It's another thing to seek active duty. It's another thing to continually seek the most dangerous post available to one. One gets a pension for serving. One doesn't necessarily have to get as close to the possibility of one's own destruction as necessary in order to get that pension. So, I mean, I think that there are levels of decision made by Thomas that change during the course of his military experience. And who knows, maybe it was the need to prove himself to these younger men he's continually surrounded by. But there's something, and Frost addresses this over and over when he talks about Thomas, including in that letter to Cornelius Wygant that Edna was talking about. It's the pursuit of not just service, but death that begins to trouble one. And it's one that Frost acknowledges Thomas's bravery, but he comes out finally and says, I wanted you to prove you were willing to die. It's not necessarily necessary that you actually die. And I think we have to be careful to look at Thomas's military experience as a kind of evolving series of choices as opposed to a single choice.
Yes, he didn't want the home job of just being a lecturer at home, training other people to do it. He thought,
he even turned down a job on the general staff. He turned down a job as a map trainer. He turned down opportunity after opportunity to serve in different capacities.
And
he could have been Ralph Hodgson or Ralph Vaughan Williams and do a sort of pacifist job, but he didn't want that. He wanted to be the soldier, didn't he?
Yeah, and I think his feelings about Brooke were more not just sort of guilt-ridden about not being able to compete with Brooke, but I think he admired that kind of military heroism, actually. I think You're completely right, Donald, about the sense that it evolved. You know, there are definitely two stages. You know, you enlist in 15, and then a year later, you join the artillery in order to go out, and that's a very different stage. And I think Frost's, they weren't in such close touch, I don't think, in 1916, and I think Frost wasn't happy about that second decision, as you're suggesting. You have to bear in mind the war as well, and the progress of the war, that by 16 it wasn't looking very rosy, and the sense that conscription was coming and you better go before you were pushed. I think that was working in Thomas's mind in spring of 16, when he's sort of thinking about this next stage. So I think it, as Guy says, it seems to me it's incredibly complicated and multifaceted, and there's clearly some interest in dying and death as the kind of ultimate proof of one's genuine commitment to the cause. But I think the contingent factors are quite strong as well. I think he was going to get a bigger pension for Helen if he joined the artillery. And if he stayed at home. If he became an officer, then the money would be better for her, even if it increased the risk of his not coming back.
And I wonder if, and I haven't been able to trace anything for this, but my feeling is that he actually made the decision that he was going to enlist around about November 1914, because his own income from writing and reviews was falling off the edge of a cliff, and he was worrying about how was he going to keep the family, young family, growing, and making that decision that next year I'm going to enlist almost was released the cork from the bottle that allowed him to start writing the poetry. But that's only a feeling I have. I can't.
I think that this England essay, which was read earlier, is very striking. That he's already thinking in August 14 about service, military duty, going out, joining the army. I think one of the things in his mind is, how do I make this my choice and not my father's choice? And the jingoistic poems are very much addressed to, and his hostility to his father's sort of anti-German feeling and a sense of being pushed in that direction by his father. And how do I make this my choice? And I think that's what he then, when he says it, he gets to the point when he talks about the road not taken of saying, you poets think there's a choice and there's no choice. And I think he wanted to find the point at which he wasn't choosing to do it, but when it had to happen. When it was, as it were, something which it was inevitable then, since what was innate in his nature then.
I think he was already thinking in private jottings as well as in this England, about whether he should enlist in August 1914. And he does say later, when he did join, he told Gordon Bottomley it was the culmination of a long series of moods and thoughts. And I think you're all quite right that moods and thoughts, continued and then different in relation to different contingencies afterwards. But I do think, and Donald's point, that he chose to go to the front when he needn't make that choice, needn't have made that choice. And I suppose I do see Lights Out, which is such an extraordinary poem, as was a revisiting of the signpost and the road not taken, because it's about paths, roads and woods and choices and something very complex, because there is a decision. And I actually don't think it was a death wish. I think that's what Frost is anxious to deny in saying that he went to death because he didn't like going, though there are death wish moments in Thomas's poems. That's true, but I think maybe it all comes together in Lights Out in very complex ways.
Lights Out, extraordinary poem. It's a wonder that we don't have Frost saying more about it. It may be that it hit too close to home, because if you stop and think about it, Lights Out ends in the place where so many Frost poems turn away. Frost poems are always about, no, I refuse to let the light go out. No, I haven't been called into the woods to sink into nothingness. No, I have promises to keep. Lights Out surrenders in the place that Frost fights surrender through his entire career, not because he wasn't attracted to it, I don't think, but because he was in some ways too deeply attracted to it. Frost poems are full of that, no, lift your knee, no, keep walking, no, don't go to sleep. But I thought it worth mentioning, and this is the last thing I'll say, because I'm liable to get overexcited and read the entire poem. But this is no case of petty right or wrong. It's remarkable that Thomas makes a decision to go to war by not making a decision. He quite specifically says, but I have not to choose.
Yes.
I hate not Germans, nor grow hot with love of Englishmen, but I have not to choose between the two, or between justice and injustice. And instead, these two Shakespearean witches appear and kind of make the decision for him. It's an extraordinary moment of choice being made by not choosing.
Yes, I'm glad to hear you say that about Frost's response there, because I do think that stopping by woods on a snowy evening is a response to Lights Out. It's got similar rhyme words, and you know that line. But I have promises to keep. There is a you being addressed somewhere there who could be the ghost of Edward Thomas. I have to go on. So, and I don't think he's ducking out of it. He's saying, you know, I'm tempted to join you in some sense or other, but I must continue to live.
That all the precedent is on my side. You know, there's always that turn in Frost away from self-destruction.
Because of this meeting, I was reading more Frost than I had done before, and I suddenly started, I read all North of Boston poems, and then I read A Boy's Will as well. And I was amazed at the number of echoes in Edward's poetry which are related to Frost's canon of works. And the very first poem that somebody coming to Frost would read is the first poem, the first real poem in Boy's Will, is about a dark forest. And a man going into the dark forest and saying, well, those who love me will follow me in there, and they will find me, but even more myself. And so it's complete reversal, but it's exactly the same metaphor as the Lights Out one, whereas it's the greatest sort of make peace with your mortality poem that I know, of just sort of saying, I want to lose my way and myself, and I accept that. I accept that I would probably just disappear. Whereas Frost is saying, no, I will become more and more myself. And then there's the contrast with the Rupert Brooke too. Rupert Brooke has this extraordinary transcendentalist element in that famous soldier sonnet. I mean, it's all Emerson and people like that about we are part of the cosmic mind and we will have an eternal, I mean, it is a poem about eternity, and it doesn't seem to be in Thomas. He has this otherworldliness and sees beautiful women sort of in rain-swept woods and things like this, but it's not the same transcendentalist approach, is it?
No, I think Thomas and Frost were both post-Darwinian in a sense that we should emphasize more. And when Thomas contemplated any kind of afterlife, it would be being part of the earth, it would be, you know, being ecologically absorbed somehow into the natural world. He really did, I think, reject transcendental thinking, religious feeling of that kind, although say what we might call earth mysteries, the mystery of earth, the deep history of the earth, that was a different matter.
I think finally it might come down to the value that each places on the will. Thomas seems willing to surrender will. Frost never can. There's always the will forward. There is always the will is the last recourse. I mean, in desert places, you know, I mean, it's only the fact that I want life to go on living, Frost feels, that keeps it continuing. So it's almost as though his last reliance is always on that I. And I think for Thomas, it was a little bit easier to surrender the I.
I hesitate to ask, but do you think that's American? I mean, in their approach approaches, for instance, to the landscape, the natural world. Thomas is very much part of the English nature writing tradition, and then to this day, is a model for contemporary nature writing. I do see him as a pioneer ecological poet. I think that's the whole framework in which he thinks that of putting humanity to one side as a parochial species. Whereas, this is very crude, but whereas Frost does seem to identify, well, whatever kind of farmer he was, he's more agricultural than ecological, in the sense of his relation to landscape, that you're in some kind of struggle with it, or you have to do something about it and build your wood pile, even if you're not going to burn the wood. Is that very crude? But...
Well, one thing I wonder about, though, with Thomas, he was melancholic, as they said. So did perhaps his what we might call today, clinical depression, contribute to him having kind of a thoughts of the inevitability of death? Maybe he had spent more time as a young man thinking about death without actually having to confront it, like Frost did continuously throughout his childhood and young married life, of losing parents and losing children. And so I wonder if perhaps Thomas, there was more of an inevitability of death, and that he kind of just was going to march into it if he had to.
I think, if I could just say something there, I think it's worth pointing out, though, how happy Thomas was in the army and how many people recognize that. And Paul Nash, the artist, when he heard about Thomas's death in 1917, said, "Thomas, poor fellow, always seems to have been oppressed by some load of sadness and pessimism. I believe I saw one of the happiest bits of his life when we were in the artists. He was always humorous, interesting, and entirely lovable. But others who knew him speak of him as the most depressed man they ever met." So actually, those people who knew him in the army often saw the happy side of him. And maybe there is a lingering sense of kind of suicidal tendency or pessimism underneath the decision to join the army, or maybe the pressure was off once he was in. There's a memoir by Paul Nash's wife as well, where she talks about Edward Thomas as such a happy person when she knew, when her husband knew him in the army. They talk about Thomas always wanting to go and get apple pie when they were out walking in the countryside, and his love of apples and of going to pubs as well, like a lot of squaddies would have been doing in their free time in the army. And there is all of that sense of people noticed of Thomas as being transformed by the army into a kind of a happy man. And if you're thinking about why did he join up, there is that other way of looking at it, which is, well, what did the army give him which he didn't have before? And there is that sense of male friendship and camaraderie, maybe the pressure off with work, the pension that people have talked about, maybe it's some detachment from home. In a way, joining the army is going back to the land as well, isn't it? And that pursuit of the simple life in some ways, living in huts in Essex or wherever else and spending your days tramping around the countryside like you're a teenage boy again, which is the kind of things he did for his weekends as a schoolboy. So it's quite a complex position, but a very interesting one to think about the man Thomas became in the army.
There's a little bit of a hint of that prior to the enlistment when when Peter Godwin Baines is administering some care to Thomas, and he spends a couple of weeks with the lads playing cricket and hanging out, and he mentions that time as being some of the happiest time in his life, where he seems to be reveling in the camaraderie of young men, even though they're not at war. It's a very interesting interlude. And I think ultimately, he kind of disavows what happens with Baines, but suggesting that Baines made him feel like he was the most important person in the world. And then he realized that somehow Baines had made everyone feel like that, and he didn't necessarily want to just be one of the crowd, I think, as he says. So there's a little bit of a hint of that prior to his enlistment.
To say it was very similar with Ivor Gurney, who was mentally ill, though in a different way, and worse than Thomas, but he also had his best years in the war.
If one struggles with being self-directed, I imagine that being other-directed, which is entirely what Army life is, would come as kind of a lifting of a burden. I mean, Thomas didn't have to decide what to do with each day or when to do it. You knew what you were going to be doing, and a lot of decision-making was taken out of your hands.
Yep.
I think that's a great point, and I think you see that with a lot of people, particularly writers during the First World War, where they'd have to spend their lives not knowing where their next commission's coming from, and of course no pension if you're a freelance writer or whatever. And suddenly the army does take a lot of decision out of your hands, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And at the observation post, when he went up, you know, in France, his diaries are very similar in many ways to his kind of nature observation diaries from teenage years. So it's as if he's kind of regaining the opportunity just to look at the natural world, and it was very dangerous, but it also had this clearly other appeal, that it's his old life back again.
And then, of course, it was taken away, which perhaps moves us on to the next phase that we're going to look at, which is the posthumous years, and perhaps some legacy, and where he is today. So again, if I can leave it to either Edna or John, Bob.
Well, I suppose the title, the posthumous years, speaks for itself, and Thomas will only be speaking once. In retrospect, in this section, he'll be reading that great poem of his and Frost's friendship, "The Sun Used to Shine," which also goes back to this England, the Leadington scene, the Leadington landscape, at the beginning of these readings, and we'll also be hearing perhaps 3 elegies, two direct, one more oblique, by Frost, and the readings will begin with Frost's extraordinarily moving and loving letter to Helen Thomas after Thomas had been killed. Tom?
It's Gordon.
Oh, sorry.
Where's Gordon?
Gordon, you're muted, sorry.
Here we go. It's the first time now I have to summon the letter again. Here we are. Amherst, Massachusetts, April 27, 1917. Dear Helen, people have been praised for self-possession in danger. I have heard Edward doubt if he was as brave as the bravest, but who was ever so completely himself, right up to the verge of destruction, so sure of his thought, so sure of his word. He was the bravest and best and dearest man you or I have ever known. I knew from the moment I met him at his unhappiest that he would someday clear his mind and save his life. I've had 4 wonderful years with him. I know he has done this all for you. He is all yours. But you must let me cry my cry for him as if he were almost all mine too. Of the 3 ways out of here, by death where there is no choice, death where there is a noble choice, or death where there is a choice not so noble, he found the greatest way. There is no regret, nothing that I will call a regret. Only I can't help wishing he could have saved his life without so wholly losing it, and come back from France not too much hurt to enjoy our pride in him. I wanted to see him, to tell him something. I want to tell him what I think he liked to hear from me, that he was a poet. I want to tell him that I love those he loved and hate those he hated. But the hating will wait. There'll be a time for hate. I meant to talk endlessly with him still, either here in our mountains, as we said, or as I found more and more in my longing there at Leadington, where we first talked of war. It was beautiful as he did it, and I don't suppose there is anything for us to do to show our admiration, but to love him forever. Robert. To E.T. I slumbered with your poems on my breast, spread open as I dropped them, half read through, like dove wings on a figure on a tomb, to see if in a dream they brought of you, I might not have the chance I missed in life through some delay, and call you to your face, first soldier, and then poet, and then both, who died a soldier poet of your race. I meant, you meant, that nothing should remain unsaid between us, brother, and this remained. And one thing more that was not then to say, the victory for what it lost and gained. You went to meet the shell's embrace of fire on Vimy Ridge, and when you fell that day, the war seemed over more for you than me. But now for me than you, the other way. How over though? For even me, who knew the foe thrust back unsafe beyond the Rhine, if I was not to speak of it to you and see you pleased once more with words of mine. A soldier. He is that fallen lance that lies as hurled, that lies unlifted now, come dew, come rust, but still lies pointed as it plowed the dust. If we who sight along it round the world see nothing worthy to have been its mark, it is because, like men, we look too near, forgetting that as fitted to the sphere, our missiles always make too short an arc. They fall, they rip the grass, they intersect the curve of earth, and striking, break their own. They make us cringe for metal point on stone. But this we know, the obstacle that checked and tripped the body shot the spirit on, further than target ever showed or shone. Iris by night. One misty evening, one another's guide, we two were groping down on Malvern's side, the last wet fields and dripping hedges home. There came a moment of confusing lights, such as according to belief in Rome, were seen of old at Memphis on the heights, before the fragments of a former sun could concentrate anew and rise as one. Light was a paste of pigment in our eyes. And then there was a moon, and then a scene so watery as to seem submarine, in which we two stood saturated, drowned. The clover-mingled rowan on the ground had taken all the water it could as dew, and still the air was saturated too. Its airy pressure turned to water weight. Then a small rainbow, like a trellis gate, a very small moon-made prismatic bow stood closely over us through which to go. And then we were vouchsafed a miracle that never yet to other two befell, and I alone of us have lived to tell. A wonder. Bow and rainbow as it bent, instead of moving with us as we went, to keep the pots of gold from being found, it lifted from its dewy pediment its two mote-swimming, many-colored ends, and gathered them together in a ring. And we stood in it softly circled round from all division, time, or foe can bring, in a relation of elected friends.
The sun used to shine while we two walked slowly together, paused and started again, and sometimes mused, sometimes talked, as either pleased, and cheerfully parted each night. We never disagreed which gate to rest on. The to be and the late past we gave small heed. We turned from men or poetry to rumours of the war, remote, only till both stood disinclined for aught but the yellow, flavorous coat of an apple wasps had undermined, or a century of dark betonies, the stateliest of small flowers on earth at the forest verge, or crocuses, pale purple, as if they had their birth in sunless Hades fields. The war came back to mind with the moonrise, which soldiers in the east afar beheld then. Nevertheless, our eyes could as well imagine the Crusades or Caesar's battles. Everything to faintness, like those rumours, fades, like the brook's water glittering under the moonlight, like those walks now, like us two that took them, and the fallen apples. All the talks and silences, like memory's sand, when the tide covers it late or soon, and other men through other flowers in those fields under the same moon go talking and have easy hours.
We
Thank you,
have
Gordon.
50 hours now.
Thank you, Tom. Very, very moving, Gordon. Thank you.
You can tell by our stunned silence how moved we are by the readings and the poems. It's just,
Yeah, yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Iris by Night and The Sun Used to Shine are surely two greatest poems of the poet's friendship. I think there's an echo actually in memoriam somewhere in The Sun Used to Shine. And I remember Thomas does say somewhere that he thought there were much fewer poems of friendship than of love. But I think Frost and Thomas wrote the best. And I think it's very mysterious, their friendship. And, you know, I suppose we think about poets having friendships or being in coteries more than novelists. You know, you don't really think of two novelists in the same kind of reciprocity as happened extraordinarily in the chemistry between Frost and Thomas. And I think it's very mysterious and something to do with the mystery of poetry itself, that kind of closeness and those poetic conversations about poetry could occur. And there should be, on the one hand, such affinity, at the same time, difference. I think Frost said our congeniality could only confirm us in what we were. But nonetheless, the congeniality is itself extraordinary. And the two of them together, their legacy, and those elegies are partly about legacy to poets up to today. I think that together it's extraordinary and will continue.
I just wanted to, putting those two poems together, I've suddenly realised it's very strange that there's a moon poem and a sun poem. That's very fascinating. And just seeing you there, Edna, I remember you and Michael talking to me when we had the last meeting together. And one of the things that came up was about actors and enjambment. And it's only doing this poem over and over again. The rubato in this poem, nearly every rhyme is a sort of, it has a tremendous rubato sort of, the enjambment in this particular poem is so beautiful and fluid. It's an extraordinary, you sometimes think, oh, the memory is beginning to think, and then you look, oh, it's a rhyme word, but they're so subtly interwoven. It's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm getting some.
Sorry. I was going to say, following up from what Edna was saying, I'm wondering whether, to what extent, there was a desire for both men before they even met to have the kind of friendship that they had, and in kind of a longing even for that kind of close friendship. You know, obviously Thomas had grown up with kind of romanticism, and you kind of get your kind of romantic poets developing their close friendships and tributes to each other. And to some extent, there's a sense in him always kind of wanting that sense of close friendship with his male friends as well, which sometimes turn out to be a disappointment in some contexts.
And Thomas had five brothers, and Frost didn't have a brother at all.
Right.
I mean, growing up with 5 brothers, and poor Mrs. Thomas with 5 boys, and one of them was a bit of a, Edward didn't get on with number 2 very well, did he? Number 2.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I'm just wondering what other people think about that, and is there a kind of sense, certainly on Frost's side, that he was almost wanting that kind of friendship, or looking for it, or felt there was an absence of that kind of close literary friendship until he met Thomas? Frost
had a friendship with John Bartlett, who was a former student of his at Pinkerton Academy. He was younger. That was made, and Carl Burrell when he was in high school, and Burrell came to the farm, but they're almost rivals in a funny way. But I don't think Frost began cultivating these friendships when he went to England. I mean, I guess he had a brief friendship with Sidney Cox as well, but nothing ever like what he found in Thomas. Nothing like that.
They weren't literary friends.
Yeah. It was also his first real friendship with someone you could consider a peer. Mm-hmm. Burrell was older. Right. Cox and Bartlett were younger. It is, for all of the friends that Frost had in his lifetime, there is no real equivalent to what he had with Thomas, as brief as it was. And it may have been that after Thomas's death, he kind of pulled away from forming attachments that deep. For Frost to call him brother, and for Frost to put himself at Thomas's judgment in the same way that Thomas put himself at Frost's judgment, with a kind of absolute confidence that however critical it became, it was also in some ways there was like an inviolable trust between them. There is no other friendship or relationship in Frost that is the same.
Yeah, the other literary friendship that Frost had was with Untermeyer. And, you know, Frost and Untermeyer were oil and water in many ways, in their outlooks on life and politics, their moral actions and so forth. And I think the friendship with Thomas was water and water. They were like-minded. Mm-hmm. They had this wonderful affinity for the natural world. They're 2 poets who explore the depths of human consciousness as well as anyone. They were post-Darwinian in their outlook. They just had this shared mutual sense of what it meant to be in the world. And the intensity of that friendship is just astounding to me. And, you know, when we were rehearsing with the actors, we kept bringing up the line, happiness makes up in height for what it lacks in length. And I think that this friendship was one of a great intensity, however short-lived it was, but they were mutually fond of one another in a way that neither ever had with anyone else.
Certainly in Thomas's case, he did have some other close literary friendships and also non-literary friendships. We talked about Harry Hooton in the Icknield Way talk earlier today. I mean, obviously there's Delamere, Walter Delamere in the case of Thomas, for instance, if you wanted to pluck out another poet, arguably of equal status or almost. But it is just interesting the way that the Frost one is the friendship. And it's almost like a holiday romance, isn't it? At first, and it's kind of, they're kind of, particularly in The Sun Used to Shine, there's a sense of them both being on holiday and kind of falling in love almost. And you do wonder how, you know, how would it have developed as a friendship if they had both lived to be as old as Frost was?
Do you think Frost might have been more competitive if if Thomas had come to New Hampshire and they'd and had maybe a career of his own or something. Because I thought that one of the dynamics of the relationship was that Frost came off more as a mentor and as a shrink almost. He'd been acquainted with the knight himself for so much of his life, and now here was somebody who was almost coming to him for counsel.
The extraordinary thing about Frost coming off as a mentor is Thomas was so much more accomplished as a writer, and Frost had published virtually nothing when they met. It's a wonder that Thomas trusted his judgment in the way that he did. I mean, Thomas had books and articles and reviews and all of this behind him. Frost had a scattering of poems and a couple of newspaper columns. So that in a way, Thomas's confidence in Frost may have been as important as Frost's confidence in Thomas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we forget, that Thomas had a powerful position as a poetry critic. That those reviews of Frost, Frost was reviewed favourably by one or two other people, but nonetheless they set up Frost's reputation in England. And does we now feel that there's a reversal of literary power, perhaps, or has been subsequently between the United States and Britain and Ireland, so that perhaps from American perspectives now, Thomas looks like a more obscure figure, but you're quite right. In a way, Frost had come to England to meet influential people, and so happened that this extraordinary friendship occurred as well, and they fell into friendship indeed, like people fall in love. But I was looking at a review the other day, at a letter the other day in which Thomas is telling Edward Garnett about how to handle an article Garnett proposed to write on Frost for the Atlantic Monthly in 1915. It's in March 1915, and I think we see Thomas wanting to help Frost always. He tells him about English reviews. In America, he got only an echo or two of these. He had been at American editors 10 years in vain, but may I suggest it might damage him there if you rubbed the Americans' noses in their own dirt. I know he thought so. I wonder if he used the word dirt, actually. I know he thought so. Most English reviewers were blinded by theories they had as to what poetry should look like. They did not see how true he was, so pure in his own style. So that's interesting that Thomas is trying to look after Frost's reputation in America and get, on foot of his English reputation. And apparently Garnett's article did make a splash. It was called a New American Poet, and Frost was pleased with it. And Andrew Motion too this afternoon speculated as to whether Frost might have grown competitive with Thomas, but if he'd lived and gone to America. But I think Frost would have been different. The whole dynamic would have been different, and maybe Frost wouldn't have felt in some ways so isolated at times and paranoid about his reputation and needing to seek certain kinds of popularity outside the academy if Thomas had been there with him. But that's all what if.
Edward Thomas really did want to go to America. We get in the correspondence, not all in the correspondence we didn't read, he really does want to go. He's waiting for the war to finish and then he can take the family. It sounds a bit cruel that mother might have to be looked after, but of course it was. Helen and the children were all going to go. And you think, oh, well, I thought you were so in love with England that you'd never want to go and live in America. There's this little bit of a paradox there.
Well, I think he wanted to meet some of those characters from north of Boston.
Yeah. Well, and his son was already in America, right? I don't know how long Mervyn stayed. I think obviously didn't stay to live in America, but he went there with, that's how much he trusted Frost, right? He said, here, you can take my son with you to America.
You know, one of the things that Don and I have talked about in the past is that in some ways Thomas was Frost's second friendship after he arrived in England. And the first year he spent an awful lot of time with Frank Flint.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Flint who had introduced Frost to Pound and Hume and Yeats. And Flint actually commented on the manuscript of North of Boston. And for reasons that are a little bit obscure, that relationship kind of dissolved after the first year. And Thomas, of course, becomes the great confidant. But I think in some ways Frost felt a little bit guilty that that relationship with Flint had faded. And I think there's a letter that Frost composes right before he's sailing back to America from England, kind of lamenting about not hearing from Flint. But that first friendship was very important to Frost as well, from a kind of establishing standpoint. But it wasn't the same kind of friendship that he had with Thomas. Just astonishing, the difference. And part of it was, I think, that Flint was so imbued with Pound and the Imagists, and Frost's sense of aesthetics were so different from Flint and Pound. And, you know, I think that had a big sense, perhaps, of why their friendship did
Yeah, Flint
last.
was more
Yeah.
intimately involved with the creation of North of Boston than virtually anyone else. And Frost gave him a lot of the work to read, responded to his suggestions and advice, but there was not the same kind of connection, obviously, that formed with Thomas. And part of it may be that Flint was a London friendship, and Frost met Thomas, and the ground that they shared in England may have been as important a part of their friendship as anything else. They were both so comfortable on that ground, and it was so much of the both of them that it allowed for a kind of greater expression of affinity. But
they were the 20th century's version of Coleridge and Wordsworth, I think.
I was going to say exactly that, actually, Robert, because I think that the kind of the sense that their friendship began in a sense of literary kinship, and that they were kind of sharing feelings about Sound of Sense and about the hard material reality you were talking about, that has to get into poetry somehow, and you need the speaking voice. There's all sorts of congruence between people think that Thomas sort of bought into Frost's thinking, or was sort of taught how to understand poetry from Frost, but in fact it's mutual. There's a very clear reciprocity between and kind of bringing together of these two personalities around shared literary ideas and thinking about where poetry should go now, and that seems very similar to Wordsworth and Coleridge. You know, when they meet in 1797, you know, they're both thinking, how do we shake up poetic diction, and we should do this, and so I mean, Wordsworth and Coleridge were kind of very fruitful with each other, only for about 5 years. And, you know, from about 1802 onwards, after Dejection and such, you know, they remain friends, but they don't have the same sense of energizing mutual investment in a shared project. And you kind of wonder if Thomas had lived, and you wonder even if their kind of friendship would have remained, but sort of lost its intensity, because they both have their own path to follow now.
the one place I've always thought it might have stumbled eventually would have been Thomas's marriage and the very different way in which Frost conceived of relations between men and women, husband and wives. Even when we were just saying about Thomas sending his son with Frost is something that Frost would not have done going the other way. Frost had a very different sense of family and of marital monogamy, and I think that might have been eventually a grounds for foundering, but I'm just speculating. Frost elsewhere is very strict about such things, although with Thomas he seems to have been willing to forgive more.
And that letter to Helen when Thomas dies is amazingly beautiful and deeply felt. I kind of I mean, Gordon read it with such skill, but it's amazing what he says there. And there's a kind of real sorrow to my mind that relationship between Helen and Frost really went sour, and his reaction to her memoir is violently hostile, and I think regrettable, actually. And you sense that kind of difference in their understanding of marriage and family relations and sexuality and liberal kind of thinking about that, which Helen had certainly got in her background. That might have kind of continued, as you're suggesting, Donald, to kind of infect, or might have kind of troubled their relationship.
Wasn't that a relation? Weren't they jealous of each other? Surely Helen and Robert Frost were mutually jealous, and Helen was jealous of Eleanor Fargen, I think, with actually less cause in some ways, because as you've all been saying, this is a relationship of extraordinary intensity, and I don't really want to use the term homoerotic, but maybe a dimension of that, as there may be in many male friendships. And I do think there was jealousy, and what's wonderful about that letter, really, in one way, Frost is staking a claim as if you're almost all mine too, and that is quite extreme, but that's an offering of we will share him in some way posthumously, but
and kind of understandably Helen wasn't on for that,
Yes. Well, and
that was ridiculous.
Yes.
The most remarkable statement in that letter is Frost giving Thomas to Helen exclusively. When he says he did all this for you, he knows at some level that's exactly what she needs to hear. He also knows it's not entirely true, but it's almost as though he cements their marriage in that gesture. In retrospect, and sort of closes that whole deal. He did this all for you. This is now on the record from me as a reliable witness. It's a very strange thing to feel the need to say.
Absolutely,
but he does.
That's kind of claim.
Before he stakes his claim, he makes hers absolute.
Yeah, I think Frost also felt that one had an obligation to maintain the dignity and decorum of a private life. And, what's interesting, we're involved with editing Frost's letters, and we don't have a single letter to Eleanor. Where those letters went, we assume there must have been some.
Oh, yeah.
But we don't have them. And those letters were most likely destroyed because they simply did not want their private lives to be public. The way that I think Helen made her life with Edward public.
Yeah, and I think perhaps prudity may be too strong a word, but the problems he had with Louis and Jean Untermeyer and their marital problems, and he was very much disapproving of all that, and that, oddly enough, you're like, well, why do you care? It's their marriage. But he took it very personally. And perhaps in the same way, he took the things that Helen wrote, which were very personal and intimate about their relationship. And he kind of felt like, well, you should have kept that to yourself. But it did somehow seem to threaten him. Also, as you say, almost like a jealousy, to hear these things, almost like a past lover that you've heard these things about that you don't want to hear about. And but I did often wonder, as much fun as it sounds to have a best friend as a grown person that you can just go wandering off. And I thought about this Iris by Night. Well, they didn't have cell phones. These guys were gone after dark. So you're stumbling home after midnight from the Malvern Hills. That's a long ways away. It's raining, it's dark. And again, I think many a wife would be like, standing at home, you left me with these children, we don't even have electricity,
What time do you call this?
So, I was wondering, could we move on to another posthumous aspect? I feel this is a marvelous opportunity to ask the Robert Frost Society, why is Thomas's reputation in the United States not higher, or have you been doing quite a lot to boost Thomas and Frost together as well as Frost separately. I seem to have gone but once every 10 years and addressed some American university audience to the effect, why is Edward Thomas not better known over here? So, well, I may not live long enough to do that again, but you know, I really would like to know what you think about that.
Well, in the cruelest terms, here's my answer: better known than whom? What British poets after Eliot or after, I mean, what other than Larkin, what British poet is known in the sense that we're talking about?
David Jones.
Ted Hughes, maybe.
All the scholars in Canada and America that they're writing about Mr. Jones. I want to know what, because most contemporary poets are sort of saying, oh, Frost and Thomas showed us the way to get ordinary speech and plain words into poetry, what would they have made about the Robert Bridges suddenly publishing 1918 Hopkins? And what would they have, what did Frost think of Hopkins and Eliot and David Jones? I mean, that is a completely other use of language, isn't it? I mean, it's often conversational. There's elements of Browning monologue and things, and even Hopkins is now revealed to use bits of demotic speech in Felix Randall and things like that. But it's a very, very different sort of poetry, isn't it?
I don't think Frost and Thomas are just about demotic speech. I think they're about a great many other things too, and they're aesthetically. And I do think two poets whom we haven't really mentioned, whom both Thomas and Frost revered and may have learned from, Yeats and Hardy.
Yeah.
Thomas wrote some of the most prescient and interesting reviews of Yeats from the early 1900s onwards, and he wrote about speech in Yeats's poetry and dramas before he wrote about that in relation to Frost. He also wrote about Sing from that angle as well, and in fact D.H. Lawrence was also a discovery of his, or he promoted D.H. Lawrence's poems. So I do think there's a whole set of traditions, if you like, to which we can connect Frost and Thomas on both sides of the Atlantic. And in fact, they're quite a convergence of things happening in Frost and Thomas from
very
modern poets.
Very clever use of convergence. Hardy is extremely important to Frost. I think Frost distrusted Yeats' mysticism. He distrusted Yeats' high rhetoric. He was a little bit jealous of Yeats, but Hardy is Frost's man all along. And the deeper you look, the more you find Hardy in Frost. So yes, I would very much agree with that. The point I was trying to make before is that if you consider Thomas as a kind of World War I, post-World War I poet, there really has been no British poet of that generation who has captured American attention in the way that Frost captured British attention. So that when you say, why isn't Thomas more highly regarded? The question I was asking was not facetious. More highly regarded than whom? I mean, it's almost as though an enormous gap of American interest and attention to British poetry occurs in those years.
Dana Joy has written on that comparatively recently. He's asked, and he blames American insularity.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And I'd also venture that, in this country, the aesthetic ruptures of Pound and Eliot, and even later William Carlos Williams, had an enormous effect on the poetic practice of American poetry in the way that high modernism never really disrupted the practice in England. I mean, England is filled with formal poets from Hardy all the way through the 20th century. And even though there's been a resurgence of formal poetry in the United States from, say, the 1980s to the present, for a long time, most everyone was writing free verse poetry in a way that I didn't see the British poets being so imbued with. In some ways, I think Eliot was a kind of minor disruption and never really had the same kind of, I want to say, legacy of influence that some of the other poets in England had on British practice. So I think that could possibly be one reason. I mean, you were thinking about Thomas, Edna, you and I were talking earlier about Thomas influencing Heaney with the digging poems, for example, and Thomas influencing Ted Hughes, for example. And we just didn't see that Thomas, or even Frost for that matter, really influencing that next generation of poets here.
Other than Richard Wilbur, perhaps.
Right, Wilbur, right, might be the exception. But they were rare, I think. When Don was proposing his dissertation topic at the University of Virginia, his committee balked that he wanted to write on Robert Frost. He wasn't a serious enough poet.
Yeah.
So Frost's reputation had declined for a good period of time, at least among academics, even though he remained wildly popular with the town gown audience.
He was seen as the end of a tradition, not in any way a kind of foundation for one. It took many, many years and some very important work by people like Poirier and Pritchard to bring Frost back into critical credibility. We wouldn't be having this conversation without a few books like that. Frost was pretty much written off.
Interesting.
So
I would
just
go back to Edna's.
Go on. Somebody
I was
spoke.
going to say, back to Edna's original question. I remembered seeing it in this email thread earlier about why he isn't better known, and could we, do something about that? And I think certainly, kind of one avenue in is through Frost studies, but I think Thomas would stand very well on his own in, eco-criticism, in nature poetry, which is a very popular field right now too. I think his prose, we were saying, it's so beautiful. And that is just, it's timeless, it's places you've never been to, but they come alive for you in his writing. And so I think there is a place for him, and now with more things becoming easily available in digital form, I think that, and with publication of various letters, and I guess, Guy, are you doing the Icknield Way? And
Yes.
right? So, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think also it's just kind of worth saying that there could have been an American Thomas in a different way too, because if you look at the books Thomas was proposing to write to his agent, and which he was trying to get commissions for, that included him proposing a book on Henry David Thoreau, a book on Whitman, and he didn't get commissioned to write those books, but there could be another sense of Thomas having an American reputation through himself as a critic of American literature as well. I was just going to make another point, actually. Several minutes ago, somebody suggested what would Thomas have made of Hopkins. I did try looking into that at some point to try and see whether Thomas could have read Hopkins. He did, I think. I think he definitely reviewed one book that had a not very good Hopkins poem in, because of course a little bit of Hopkins gets published before 1918. And then whether Thomas ever saw Robert Bridges' Spirit of Man anthology, I don't know, because that came out in 1916, but that had quite a lot of Hopkins in it. But it is just one of those interesting things, what kind of effect would Hopkins have had on Thomas? Both wonderful poets with quite a lot in common, although quite a lot of difference too. I guess it's only speculation. Yes. What did Frost make of Hopkins? Did anybody know? Did he read him at all? Or
Talks a little bit about the sprung rhythm and the prosody a little bit, but there's not a lot of commentary that I remember.
On the left.
So we've got a little comment from Robert Capuccio, who says it was Heaney's essay on Frost in the New Yorker that really awakened Americans to Frost, or to him, he says. A poet of Heaney's stature needs to awaken Americans to Thomas. Edna? You know one?
Well, maybe one or more amongst us at the moment. So, yes, I do think it is the advocacy of poets and academics as well, though I think poets can be more important than like Larkin's advocacy of Hardy, for example, did a great deal for Hardy in the side of the Atlantic. So, but I think you always have to keep pushing. I mean, at the beginning, we all talked about how many years of our lives had been spent in reading, writing about, editing Frost and Thomas, and so the work will continue. And I'm interested to know that I hadn't fully realised how much Frost's reputation had languished and now has recovered. And so similarly with Thomas, and so maybe now is a moment, well, of course, to continue to advocate them separately, but also partly together. I do find it very odd. I think there's a kind of literary nationalism involved, perhaps on both sides of the Atlantic, but it seemed to be particularly extraordinary in an American poetic nationalism, which I seem to have come up against when talking about Thomas in the States, and it's very odd that because Pound and Eliot in a way captured London in a way that Americans can be like proud of. We went there, we took it over, whereas this extraordinarily subtle Anglo-American literary relation between Frost and Thomas, in which everything about poetic form, if you like, everything about pastoral, everything about metaphysics is all in a way in the mix. And in their interaction between them, and that is strangely not noticed in the way that poets who seem to more stand in some national canon are promoted.
You've given me a tremendous idea. Frost advocated for Thomas unsuccessfully. Was very disappointed he couldn't get Thomas's poems published by Holt, and he also advocated for Thomas with Louis Untermeyer, and Untermeyer demurred, and that was a big loss because Untermeyer's anthologies were so incredibly influential for so long. I think I'm going to look a little bit further into when and why Frost stopped advocating for Thomas. Why was there not a second push? Particularly in say the early 30s when Frost was at the height of his popularity, or later when he was consultant to the Library of Congress, poetry consultant. Frost could have done more to further Thomas' poetic fortunes. It's an interesting question. Maybe someday I'll have an answer for you.
One thing that's fascinated me, and quite recently, and it was Virginia, excuse me, who brought it up for me, that that new military statue memorial in Dubuque, is that how you pronounce it? Dubuque. Great big 24-foot sculpture, and it has Thomas's reign inside it. And I just wondered what the background to that might be, Virginia. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I had read about it at the time and how they picked it. I think there were two different poems. So one of them, it was a memorial to a local Dubuque, I think it was a chaplain, who, so this was a statue that was kind of like almost like a silo or a tunnel. And so there was a chaplain who earned the Medal of Honor, I think, in World War II for rescuing other men by pushing them out a porthole. And the idea was this was the last thing he saw before he died. It was like water rushing in through this hole. So they had inscribed the poem Rain into it, and who it was that knew that poem or chose it, I do not know, because it was World War II, not World War I, that this was memorializing, or an event from that, or a local Dubuque citizen. And there was another poem that I can't remember. It's, I think, on our Facebook pages. I think we both posted it there. No, it was fascinating. It was just, one of those things that came through in my feed. looking for Edward Thomas. And yeah, I wish I knew more.
Yeah. So we're way over time, which isn't a problem for me so much at the moment, but it may be for some of you who have homes to go to and such like. And I know we're keeping our participants up late at night. I do have a question from Daniel Toomey, although it's perhaps more of a statement. Thomas's prose can be found in a number of nature anthologies in the US, most notably the Norton Anthology of Nature Writing. It seems to me, to the degree that he is known in the US, it is more as an essayist than as a poet right now. Any thoughts?
It's a very interesting point. I was going to ask the question, actually, in terms of Thomas's reputation, whether the interest in Thomas among British nature writing, like Robert Macfarlane, for instance, has crossed the Atlantic. And, you know, I don't know whether Robert Macfarlane has got a big American audience, for instance, but clearly Thomas is very important to him, and he mentions Thomas all the time. So I was wondering whether Thomas has gained something of a reputation in the States through the recent British nature writing, mostly in prose. So that point might back that up, actually. That very good point that Daniel's just made.
Yeah, certainly, yeah, he stands out. Yeah, as you say, Macfarlane is one who definitely kind of puts Thomas front and center. He's almost like a spirit guide to him or something.
Right, well, I think we're probably coming to a wonderfully natural conclusion. It's been a wonderful evening. It's been enriching for me and rewarding to be in the company of such genius, as one person has just said. And so many people have said that the readings by both Gordon and Tom, and the recitals, so moving and so powerful.
Here.
And yeah, and thank you all ever so much. I hope we'll be able to do a reprise. Certainly, we're hoping, as the museum and Edward Thomas Fellowship partnership, hoping to put on another one in a year's time. We hope to become inaugural, and perhaps between us, we can get both Frost and Thomas back up to the places that they deserve to be. Thank you all ever so much. This is always the Marx Brothers moment, isn't it? Where we sit here for bye now. I'm going, yeah, bye. And
Bye.
so thanks ever so much. I'm going to end it all now. Yes, it's been a great evening. Thank you ever so much, and see you all again soon.